So how did the debate with Robert Sapolsky go?
It was entertaining, but Robert makes one big mistake, and it's right at the center of his work. He wants to, in fact, it's a sort of version of the mammals paradox. He says, you're not making a free choice because every act you perform depends on things that happened earlier and happened earlier and happened earlier. And we go back to the Big Bang, and determinism is true, and so you can't make a free choice. And what he's missed is the difference between control and causation. Let me illustrate that with an example. There's an earthquake, and a boulder starts to roll down one of the Rocky Mountains. Bouncy, 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 down it goes. Okay. It's caused to roll down the mountain by gravity, wind pressure, bumps on the way, material, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera.
Yep.
Now, if we rewound the tape of life right to and replayed that exact circumstance, it would roll in exactly the same way. That's determinism. But if we don't get it exactly right, then who knows? In fact, the path of the rock is uncontrolled. But the only way you can tell it's uncontrolled is by varying the circumstances and seeing whether the behavior is varied. Now, compare that with a really good skier. She's a downhill specialist, and she skis down the mountain. We want to know if that's controlled or not. Well, have her run down again and again and again. Have her do 10 runs. She'll end up crossing the finish line in all of those cases in almost exactly the same amount of time. Very reliable result. That's control. Now, if she goes out of control, she becomes more like the boulder. Now, the path of the boulder is determined. The path of the skier is determined. Mm-hmm. But the difference is that the skier's path is controlled and the rock's path is not. The rock's path is like a coin flip. Coin flips, we call them random for good reason, because they're not predictable and they're not controllable. That's the key. But they're determined. You can't prove that determinism is false by flipping coins. Yeah, ridiculous. And you can't prove that determinism is false by saying, look, evolution depends on random variation and mutation, because the randomness of evolution isn't quantum randomness. It's physical, chaotic randomness. It's deterministic randomness, if you like. So, if you make the distinction between control and causation, then Sapolsky's argument simply falls apart, because it doesn't go back to the Big Bang. Because once life gets started, you start making what life does is it generates controllers. It generates self-controlled little agents, things that are alive. And they're alive because their parts are better suited for reproduction than the other variants. That's the whole key to evolution, right? Now, we know that evolution doesn't depend on quantum randomness because we have lots of models in computer science models of evolution, where evolution happens in virtual worlds where the only randomness is the pseudo-random number randomness of the random number generator, which is, of course, not a quantum device. Oh, it could be, but it doesn't have to be. All it has to be is uncontrolled, like a coin flip. Now, here's a case where philosophers made the mistake of thinking, well, it's very important not to be too predictable. Because if you're too predictable, you can be exploited by other agents. Right. So let's all have our coin flippers in our head. Then we're not practically practically predictable. Here's my pragmatism coming out. We don't need randomness. We just need a good coin flipper. And we suppose if you're going to play rock, paper, and scissors, your best strategy is to play randomly. Quantum randomly? Should you invest in a Geiger counter and a quantum device? No, you don't need it. In fact, you could coin flip or roll a 3-sided die or something, a 6-sided die with 3 choices, rock, paper, scissors. And you could write down a list, 1 million elements long, which would determine what your next move would be. Just keep the list secret and you're all set.
Uh-huh.
Nobody can beat you. They can tie you, but they can't beat you in the long run. But you're determined, but you're not predictable. Now, this is something that everybody should know, and it's amazing the people that don't realize it. Indeterminism is not required for unpredictability. And determinism doesn't prevent you from acting locally, making your own choices, and not being controlled by the past. The past doesn't control you.
So would the difference between you and Sapolsky be that you're saying if you have impartial information, then you can have something that's unpredictable to someone on the outside, but he's speaking cosmically, like, well, the universe has all its information.
If you have a generator of pseudo-random numbers at your disposal, and you can keep that generator secret from agents that want to control you, then you're unpredictable and you've got the freedom you need. And you do need that freedom. And the amazing thing is that evolution discovered this. Evolution discovered that because evolution pseudo-randomly makes a lot of mutations, and the ones that survive because they do things that the competition doesn't do, and this is what gives them a kind of control, a kind of reliability. The first replicators that ever existed had a minimal kind of control. And the whole history of evolution can be viewed as the amplification of control mechanisms.
What is Robert's response when you tell him this?
Well, I didn't tell him that exactly because I didn't have the time, but I laid out the main points. And his response is, no, that's you're still determined by the events going way back to before your birth. And David Haig has this lovely example which shows the fallacy in that, and he calls it the parable of the bathtub.
Right. There's a quotation. Just a moment. If you make yourself really small, you can externalize virtually everything. Right.
That was a quotation from my book, Elbow Room. And it was probably the most important sentence in the book. And I had the stupid idea of putting it in parentheses as a sort of joke. But it's actually the most important sentence in the book. Look, I'm not an extensionless point that makes undetermined decisions. I'm a big thing. I'm a big thing made of lots of design parts. And those design parts, each one of them creates a basin of attraction. Now, this is the parable of the bathtub. We've all heard about the butterfly that flaps its wings in South America and causes a storm in Sydney, Australia. That's the butterfly effect, where tiny things have huge effects. And what Haig does is he simply turns out and says, yeah, and huge things have tiny effects. And he gives some wonderful examples. And the simplest one is a bathtub. It's a lovely example because, as he says, a bathtub is literally a basin of attraction. You fill it up with water. Where's the water come from? Who cares? You can pour it in from bottled water. You can it can rain. You name it. All those water molecules get into the bathtub. Then you pull the plug, and it all drains out the same hole. And which water molecules, where they go, this cancels out all the differences in causation that went before. Simply cancels them out. A basin of attraction is just the opposite of a butterfly effect. And because it's just the opposite, it means that you are reliable in spite of variations in your past.
Okay.
So, and this simply undoes the main premise of Sapolsky's book. So, by the way, I'd like to point out, here is a philosopher telling a biologist, Sapolsky, something that I learned from another biologist, David Haig. And the difference between David Haig and Robert Sapolsky is that Haig is also a philosopher, and a very good one. And Sapolsky has a tenure for philosophy and tends to look down his nose at it. And so he makes big philosophical mistakes because he does not have respect for the philosophers that try to point these out to him. And it's an occupational hazard of philosophy. He's not alone. There are lots of scientists who have no time for philosophy.
If you enjoyed that clip, then the full podcast is out right now. You can click around here. Enjoy. Subscribe to Theories of Everything to get notified of upcoming podcasts, as there are new full-length podcasts every week on the topics of mathematics, physics, consciousness, free will, and AI.